Thanks for coming on the show. Today we've got Matt here, probably one of the most famous CX people in the world. And at the start of the interview, I like to share a beverage. So can you tell us a bit about what we're drinking today?
Yeah, so we, after lengthy debate and discussion, I have to say, have landed on the Coloman Macchia Bay Scotch whiskey. There we go. Cheers.
Cheers.
What
So
a fantastic drink.
You've got a special
Amazing.
version. Seems you've got some kind of hookup in the industry. I'm here with a standard bottle.
Did you hear that? I hope the microphone picked that up. It's a lovely cork.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, it's a very big cork, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's a kind of stumpy, unusual shaped bottle, distinctive bottle, building a distinctive brand asset, as our colleagues Ehrenberg Bass would have to say about it. Yeah.
And is yours 46% as well, or over there it would be like what 92 proof, or?
It's 46%.
Yep.
Yeah. It's not at the cask strengths. It's just I'm not quite sure what it means when it says collaborative vatting, but it's definitely pretty fucking good. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I really am a fan of Coloman, and considering the age, so whiskey is a terrible business to get into because of the capital requirement and the fact that you can't rush it. So you've got to kind of sit around for 10 or 12 years to see whether your product's any good, which is very capital intensive and requires a lot of upfront investment. And of course, it makes a kind of mockery of forecasting demand, because if you make too much 12 years down the line, like, will there be anyone to buy it? And if you make too little, you can't go back and add more, like that delay in between production or distillation, I guess, and maturity kind of exposes you to a great deal of risk. So first, kudos for setting up a new distillery. And also they're fully, as I understand it, and this might be a little incorrect, they're fully vertically integrated in that the distillery is on the farm where they grow the barley. So it's grown, distilled, bottled, and aged on the premise. Now, there's a lot of weird and slightly nerdy debate about whether you should say something is an Islay whiskey if the grain isn't from Islay, or if it's distilled there but not aged there, or if it's whatever. Like, so there's all sorts of what I call like needle dick technicalities about is it legit, is it not legit? But I think that Coloman, probably given the age of this bottle, I've got no idea how old it is. It's certainly very light. It's not showing a lot of age.
I think
I'm guessing 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah, it's at least 6 or something like that, I think. But like they purposely don't put the age on because it's a bit of a fallacy sometimes that an older whiskey tastes more complex.
Certainly. Yeah, they all seem to have a sweet spot. So like Talisker for me, 10 years, just looking over past my screen at the bottle of Talisker, like 10 year for me has a nicer flavor profile at 10 years than 18. So yeah, it's definitely a bit of a misnomer, but I do think that as some of these Colomans, I've got a few of them, start to age out, they're going to become absolutely awesome, like a real force to be reckoned with in the mainstream rather than just in the kind of niche whiskey nerd community. So yeah, I'm a huge fan, and the Macchia Bay I think is definitely one of my favorites. So
well,
cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for sharing a beverage, and you've got quite the formidable collection. I know prior to this interview, you showed me your whiskey stand. Is it, or just full of whiskeys?
Yeah. Well, I have N bottles where N+1 is the ideal number. So I think I'd guess I've got around 70, 80.
Nice.
I don't know.
I like it. Well,
as you know, I mean, you're a kind of connoisseur of wine and champagne, right? So as you know, like the flavor profiles vary quite dramatically, and that's certainly true in whiskey. So there's a very broad spectrum, and it's it's a passion of mine, and I really enjoy it. So
That's
I'll
great.
continue to add as and when time passes, or there's a special occasion, or whatever, So I love the stuff.
And do you have a bottle of Octomore 6.1, by the way, or not?
So I've got an Octomore here this was a gift from a friend, so it's in a sampling bottle where he sent it to me to see whether I liked it. I can't see the label from here, but I have got one of the Octomores. I've got about yay much of it.
Nice.
Yeah, I thought surprisingly well integrated given the amount of phenols in there, or the amount of peat in there.
You know what was interesting?
Yeah, surprisingly drinkable.
The other night, I had a whiskey worldwide expert, do a virtual tasting. So, decanted little small bottles, and everyone was over Zoom, and he was telling us all about it. And I didn't know that
Wow.
he's going into the level of the different varietals of barley and where they're growing. So he's like, oh, this one has a bit of bear barley, and this one's pearl barley, and then there's this other type. And the barleys, they only last a couple of years before disease sets in to that varietal, and they have to sort of create a new hybrid, much like bananas, really, and some other fruits and vegetables, because there's this sort of leaf rust or fungus sort of traps in, and they can't use the varietal anymore. So there's some very old sections of old barley apparently that are on some of these remote islands, which are very revered because of the depth and complexity of the grain imparts a lot of that flavor. So that was something I didn't know. And then he starts talking about ppms of peat, diluted smoke taint. So this one's on the lighter side of Islay whiskies, right? So he said around 20 ppms or something like that.
Yeah, for me, this Scotch has a nice briny edge to it that I quite like. So it's not overpowering with the smoke. It's not. There's definitely the cask influence in terms of leaning more towards a bourbon cask than a sherry cask, but I think that salinity, wherever it comes from, definitely integrates and balances really beautifully against the peat, and it creates this kind of. When I was a kid, you used to have those sweet and sour penny sweets, where they're a little bit revolting, but you can't stop eating them. So there's definitely that juxtaposition of flavors in there of this sweet and then this kind of salt that definitely works for me. So
that's great.
I'm a fan.
There's some Pinot Noirs that are grown in Victoria down south that are sort of near the seaside, and the membrane or waxy membrane on the outside of the skin, it does collect some of the saline sort of air, so the salt that's washed up into the air, and then that does get imparted into the flavor, because you can definitely tell a seaside Pinot versus an inland Pinot, which is probably a couple of kilometers away from each other. I really like it as well.
Yeah, there's a guy that you might want to check out called Michel Couvreur, who's a Belgian who tankers distillate from Scotland to Burgundy, gets the sherry casks from Spain that he hand selects, and then they're aged in a damp cave in Burgundy. So it's technically not a Scotch, but the whiskey is absolutely outrageous. I mean, it's really, really good stuff. I don't know whether they sell it down there, but Michel Couvreur is one that I think you would really enjoy.
We're talking about that the other night, so I'm going to have to get a bottle of that and try it, because that's the second person that's told me about it.
Yeah, the Candide expression, I think, is the one to go for. It's just called Candide. Very, very nice. I highly recommend it.
Great.
I endorse this product.
No commercial.
I'm Matt Watkinson, and I endorse Michel Couvreur Candide. It sounds like an advert, but actually it's really good stuff.
So 2020 President Matt Watkinson.
Sponsored by Michel Couvreur whiskey. Yeah.
It's very dapper.
They're all sponsored by somebody. Yeah, they're all sponsored by somebody.
Hey, so I was just getting into the crux of why I wanted to talk to you. I was doing a bit of background research, and like all the guests that I have on my show, I stalked their last couple of podcasts. And I found out a bit about your history in one of these. I think it was with the Gasp podcast.
Oh,
Which is
right.
great.
Yeah, Giles.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Giles. Yeah, a really good guy. And
my countryman.
yeah, and you sort of open up about your history. And I find once you become a specialist in a field like yourself, you always come from a certain perspective. So
Yeah.
you're sort of bound by your history a tiny bit. And I think that sort of lends a flavor to your focus or some of your strengths within your discipline. And I found out that you came from a design background, website, then into workflows and sort of into the business from that perspective. So
Yeah,
would it be fair to
true.
say that that's sort of flavored your take on CX versus perhaps a guest that I had the other week on CX who is very much from that sort of customer service side of the business?
That's a very good question. And of course, it's quite hard to assess your own working practice dispassionately. But I would say that my practice has been shaped by a conscious awareness of my ignorance rather than a conscious awareness of my strengths and background. So even though I started in interaction design, service design, and made my way into it that way, at some point in my career, I had this epiphany, I suppose, or maybe a small epiphany, like an epiphany elbow, about actually the point was really about integration. So I devoted a lot more energy in the last 5 or 7 years to learning about anything other than my own field, with the belief that more value would come from that. So more value would come from trying to understand marketing or brand building or sales or any of those other things, very intentionally trying to avoid being a guy with a hammer who sees everything as a nail, which I think is something of a problem, not just within the fields that I operate within, but is a kind of natural human tendency anyway. So yeah, I although I did come in through design, I'm very consciously aware that design is not the solution to everything.
Yeah, because I just really like the way you visualized and laid out your books. I think a lot of thought has gone into that process. The grid in itself, and we'll talk about your books in a bit. I can just tell you've got definitely that creative design aesthetic and mix that with a really good understanding of the business. And I think, sometimes other CX people can get a bit held up in sort of operational business process side of things, and you lose that way of visualizing how to approach the discipline.
Yeah, I also think there's a tendency to be bound by ideology rather than evidence as well, which can be problematic. I think a lot of the thinking that dominates the practice of customer experience is driven more by the way that we would like the world to be rather than necessarily how the world actually operates. A classic example being the fixation on deepening loyalty, whereas any marketer who's worth their salt will tell you that loyalty effects as a path to growth are somewhat limited, and really you always really want to be growing your brand by expanding your customer base, a la Byron Sharp or whoever, or Field and Binet, or whoever your kind of guru of choice is on that particular topic. And yet when you try and bring that inflection to the discipline, it's the antibodies reject it. They don't reject it based on any evidence or any pragmatic case study material. They reject it based on the fact that they want to live in a world where loyalty really matters. So that's what they focus on, right? So, because it's one of those things that feels good to talk about. It's one of those things that feels like it should be right. Kind of like our relationship with a business should be like our relationship with a friend or a spouse or our family or whatever. So it feels good to think about it in those terms, even if the evidence and the real world dynamics aren't the same. It still gives people a feel good feeling to talk about it like that. And that's a kind of frustration of mine.
Yeah, look, I had to do the same thing. I mean, I come from a classical marketing training. It was Kotler, it was all about segmentation, go after your heavy buys, 80-20 rule. Like it's a great
Yeah.
alluring kind of thing to do. Whereas, there's this small subset of really high value customers who will purchase over and over again that are worth a lot of money. But yeah, let's focus and target them. But then you realize you read some other work that's maybe a bit more current and scientifically valid, and it just throws all that out the window, and you lose a part of all that sunk cost of years of thinking like that. It's quite confronting to change your perspective.
It definitely is, and it's disconcerting to people. But I've seen. So as you know, I run my own design shop agency, and we do strategy, whatever. But the story isn't about my business. It's about agency businesses. That there's a very pronounced trend in agency businesses, small agencies, to win a big client that through a friend or however you get started. So you win your big client and you milk them for all they're worth, and you just double down on trying to build their loyalty and try and increase their spending. And you do that, and it's great. And you could build a seven-figure business that way, kind of pretty easily with the right luck. If they happen to be a business that spends big on agencies, that can be achieved quite simply with a good tailwind. But then whether they continue, whether you retain them as a client is not in your hands, and your business is extremely fragilized. So all it takes is a change in leadership, a change in procurement policy. Your client moves on to another firm, whatever, and your whole agency has gone pop, like your whole business. So, and in fact, I've seen that happen several times, where a focus on loyalty has actually caused a business to collapse. Because ultimately, however loyal they are, they don't buy shit they don't need. And if they can't continue to buy because they don't work there, or they're dead, or whatever happens, like, they can't continue to buy from you. And I think there's this mentality of like, well, we should focus on retention because it's in our control. That is totally wrong-headed. Actually, all your risks are hidden if you focus on loyalty effects. Whereas actually what makes sense is safety in numbers and trying to broaden your customer base to insulate you from change. So that's been something that we've very, very consciously tried to do. The only metrics that we really track in the business are top line revenue, bottom line profit, and concentration. And concentration is the one that keeps us up at night. Like, a very different way of thinking about things, but that's certainly how, and kudos to Byron Sharp and all the others, and I guess guys like you or I being open-minded enough to go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me, and changing tack. And that's another thing that's been a constant throughout my career is realizing that I've made mistakes or held incorrect assumptions and being willing to change them, which, frankly, I wish more people would do when they're called out on something that is evidenced as being incorrect. There's no harm in changing your mind. Like, that's learning. We're all learning every day. Like, and learning requires going from not knowing to knowing. And if you're so fixated on your current beliefs that you won't change them, then you can't learn and you can't grow.
It's
you
funny you
become
say
irrelevant.
that. I was analyzing a client's data the other day, and I texted, private messaged Byron Sharp. I'm like, oh, you're annoyingly right, because I just analyzed it all, and it was like pretty much on perfect with some of his findings in those books. And I was like, oh, I didn't want to believe it, but then you keep doing this, and I keep proving myself wrong. So, kudos to him.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, let's get into CX. Very open-ended question. What is CX in your own words?
No idea. I mean, every day I know less and less about it. My take on it is it's pretty simple, which is that it's a means to add value for the customer by improving the quality of your interactions with them. And what that quality looks like really depends on what your brand is. So in the example of the go-to case study of Amazon, quality for them is effort and stress reduction. In the example of Apple, maybe it's ease of use, but it's also that sensory magic, the interaction with the physical product or the aesthetics of it. It's a sensory thing. So yeah, for me, it's all about value creation for the customer, but it's bound by the interaction that you have. Now, where that becomes very messy is that the only way to define it that allows you to execute pragmatically is within the context of your own business. So you're not starting from a blank slate. You have teams already. So you've got a product team, maybe you've got a social media team, maybe you've got a brand team, maybe you've got a ad agency, whatever. So what you really need to do is define what it means for your business in particular, given your context, and what anybody who is involved in customer experience will do specifically. You can't really take an off-the-shelf definition. And what tends to happen is that people start by saying, well, customer experience is any interaction. Well, isn't anything an interaction? Isn't looking at an advert an interaction? Isn't using a product an interaction? Isn't like it? And what they end up doing is they try and end up extending their tentacles into more and more and more parts of things, and finding that they become very unwelcome because it just becomes a very diffuse activity that never really delivers anything. That's one of the big problems. So you've got to kind of define it in context, or maybe break it down a little bit into specific circumstances, and also acknowledge that not everything that, and this is something I've written about, not everything that's experiential in nature probably belongs under the purview of a customer experience department. So a Nike running shoe is comfortable. That's something you experience comfort. But nobody goes for a run and says, I'm having a great customer experience in my Nike Air Max, do they? Right? Clearly that's a part of the product. So that belongs to product. Just let them get on with it. Like, you have to find out what it means in your particular organization or your particular domain, and agree that with everyone within the company, so that you don't end up in these arbitrary kind of political turf wars that are ultimately kind of self-defeating. And that's a very, very common theme. So that's kind of my take on it.
Okay, no, it's really good. I mean, that sort of flows into what I wanted to ask you. Like, isn't CX just a buzzword? Like, it's a new term for brand contact points, and the job that business analysts used to do, right? What would you say to that?
What I would say to that is that the way that business seems to progress, at least as long as I've been in the workforce, is that the ideal way to make money is to take two abstract words and glue them together and exalt them as the big thing that you need to be working on. And the good thing about them being abstract is that you first of all get to argue about what they mean. And then you get to argue about how to deliver them and what the benefit of them is. And you are able to conjure kind of deep expertise out of nothing. So Web 2.0, what does that mean? That was the first one. Digital transformation, design thinking, all of these things, performance marketing, like, you just take these two abstract words and you say, no, this is what we need to be doing. And it's kind of inherently faddish, but that is certainly how the discipline goes. Look, I think the challenge with customer experience as a discipline is that it's devoid of context. And that's where it becomes exposed to this faddism and this buzzwordification. To the practitioner who is involved in designing experiences, it makes sense what it is. It makes sense to me in that I think about, well, we've got the product or service, we've got the brand, we've got awareness, and then we've got customer experience, which is the continuum of interactions that sits around that stuff. All of them create value, and which one you should be focusing on depends on your particular context and your own strengths and weaknesses in your industry. So, like, if you've got a chocolate teapot and no one wants to buy it, the last thing you should be spending money on is the customer experience, because you create an easy path to purchase for something that nobody fucking wants, right? Or if, as has happened with one client that I worked with, you focus on customer experience to the expense of awareness, you find your satisfaction scores go up, but your market share and revenue declines because people are forgetting to buy from you,
It's a bit
right?
self-defeating. Then the CX department disappears because they can't pay them.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm always trying to get people to think in context and say, how do you create value, and what are your strengths and weaknesses, and what's the constraint point? You know, that was the whole point of the grid, by the way, was like, what's the constraint point, and are you focused on that? So in my business, speaking about methodical, our challenge is just awareness. Like, we're in a very noisy, crowded market. There's tons of people like us in the world. When we win the work, we do a good job and people are happy, and they tend to stick around. When we get to pitch, we do a good job because we know what we're talking about and we have good conversion. But that initial awareness is our weakness. So obviously we're looking at incrementally improving everything, but what's going to drive greater value for us as a business is driving more footfall, driving more in the top of the funnel, and not worrying about the bottom. But I don't think that many people, certainly in my discipline, think in those terms. I think they have this kind of very simplistic, linear view of things that's like, well, satisfaction means loyalty. And like customer experience means satisfaction. And satisfaction means loyalty, and loyalty means money.
And
That's how they see it.
maybe the way
And
I
that's
see it
not
is,
right true.
sometimes I see it as like some people get focused too much with the product and being the best experience and offering the best quality product. And they have this belief that will spur growth because good products sell themselves, right? And people talk about them and advocate for them, and then you'll get this compounding effect. And often, as we know, like that's not always the case. So maybe they're
It's not
excluding
always the case.
some of those realities of the market.
Yeah, so I think of like, so these are very odd things for a CX guy to be saying, but I think, did you ever see the Honda COG advert where
Yes, where everything just
yeah,
works.
yeah, where everything just works?
Mm-hmm.
So have you seen the stats about how successful that was and the impact on pricing and the impact on sales and everything? Absolutely astonishing performance. I don't think I've ever seen anybody show me a case study like that from customer experience investments. I just don't think I have. You know, and I think that there's this kind of weird belief advertising is a tax you pay for having a poor experience. Utter garbage, total fucking nonsense. You look at how much time the kind of CX gurus who are spouting this nonsense spend advertising themselves on social media, and it tells you that can't possibly be true, right? And so, yeah, I've tried my best to be a CX champion for other brand activities and marketing activities, because what I do believe is that if you integrate them all together in a way that's mutually reinforcing, then it's kind of amazing. If you have a clear sense of who your brand is, or what your brand is, and you find a way to cascade that down into kind of an experiential signature, then you make everything much better, much sharper, much clearer. You know, back to Byron Sharp, you build that mental availability and you build those memory structures because everything is reinforcing. You haven't got an image here and a reality here, or an advert over here and then some totally disjointed bullshit happening over here. So I actually think that the only way that it can work is tightly coupled to other marketing activities. And I consider customer experience to be a marketing activity. And that statement alone has been enough to make me very unpopular. Because people think marketing is advertising.
Yeah.
They haven't taken the time to educate themselves on the topic.
And that's why I asked the question before about, where you come from and how it flavors it, because the same happens in the marketing field. People either come from a comms background or they come from a digital acquisition tech background, and wherever they come from definitely gives them a bias to how they think marketing is defined. And perhaps the same happens in CX. So that's why I always ask these questions. So
that's a great question.
And that's why I want to talk to you about like in CX, and the same is true for marketing. And I'm going to reference this in the discussion points. But Brian Balfour is a big guy in growth in Silicon Valley. And ex HubSpot head of growth, and he's gone on to do better things. But he has this really good concept, and it's used in HR a lot of like T-shaped skill sets. So you have a very broad remit of background knowledge. So you go pretty light on some of these areas, but you need all of them to a certain extent. And then you go really long on maybe one or two little specialties that become, what you're known for. And if you don't have that broad base, you lose the context of when you go deep down.
Sure.
So in a CX, what is the broad base that every CX professional should have, do you think?
That's an excellent question. Definitely marketing, anything and everything to do with marketing, which however you want to think about that, whether it's in disciplines or whether you consider that to be advertising, whether you consider it to be product development, whether you consider it to be like, I'm more interested in the positioning, school, or segmentation. Whatever it is, I just think that you should hoover up all the ideas and piece your own puzzle together. So I think people need to learn a lot more about marketing. I think people need to learn a lot more about sales and sales effectiveness as well. So to give context around that, one of the things that I think is massively underutilized in CX that could prove huge returns is focusing on adoption barriers, right? Not focusing on the back end and the loyalty stuff and everything that comes after you become a customer, but like systematically lowering barriers to purchase, and then taking people very rapidly from a novice to an intermediate customer. Those are, because I'm very acquisition focused, those are things that to me make perfect sense. But they only make sense to me because I've learned about marketing and product development and product strategy. So I think marketing, and then I think any major commercial discipline is worth learning about. So I always recommend this book. What is the name of the author? The book is called Financial Intelligence. But basically it explains the numbers, how they work, what a balance sheet is, how you calculate an ROI, what a profit and loss is, cash flow, working capital. These are important things that if people don't know them, you're just going to be banging your head on a glass ceiling because you can't have conversations with people above a certain seniority because you can't speak their language, and finance is the language of business. So yeah, I think any commercial discipline and just anything that's interesting. I read a lot about system dynamics because I think of a business as a system. So I'm always reading weird books on that shit. I'm always reading new books on marketing. I just think, just read anything and everything. Creativity is connecting two disparate ideas. So the more ideas you have, which come from reading broadly, the more things you can connect in new ways.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I got way better at what I do from learning, financial modeling, from learning stats, data analytics, other areas that you really need to then bring little ideas from other different disciplines. And that's why I always say you shouldn't hire someone who's just only worked in one discipline, because these job roles that always say 15 years experience in this sector, and people tend to hire other people who are from the same sector, because if they haven't worked in that sector, apparently they can't comprehend, or be of any use whatsoever. And I find the opposite is sometimes true. So they'll lend a fresh perspective that's actually very valuable. And you can learn about a sector with a couple of months of someone who's working in there and reading a couple of trade mags and that kind of thing. So but it's a human bias.
Jacob Bronowski, the scientist, said, wonderful quote, "Diversity is the propeller of evolution." You can't move forward unless you're seeking a plurality of opinions. I get this sometimes on LinkedIn, or in discussions I'm trying to have with people. I don't really want people to agree with me. I want to create a creative tension between my perspectives and others, or within two ideas that exist within your own mind, as a way to kind of move forward into new conclusions. So you want a diversity of perspectives. Like, you want to hear from people from different disciplines, different industries, different backgrounds, different countries, different everything. Like, the broader set of opinions you can get, the better, because then you can start to question your own thinking, and that's when you start to move forward. You know, like you were saying, reading.
Hey, so can we get into a tiny bit about process? Because I've got to ask this question about, okay, you know, how do you implement CX? And everyone should read your book and some of the material you've written, because you're quite prolific. But if we had to just give a quick overview to break down your approach or process when it comes to CX, what would it be? Are there certain stages or principles that we should look at when approaching CX?
Yeah, so my guiding line on that is that any project should be about solving a business challenge or capitalizing on a business opportunity. So you treat customer experience as a means, not an end, if that makes sense. So rather than saying, how can we have a quote unquote great customer experience, you start by saying, how can we use our skill set to capitalize on this opportunity or mitigate this challenge? So that's it for me, basically. Start with the problem or the opportunity, and then figure out how you can accomplish it using your skills, or vice versa. If you have a great idea for a CX initiative, and a lot of stuff is just purely idea driven, you're like, oh, I've had this great idea of how we can improve this, then just either go for it if the cost is inconsequential, or if it's not, see what kind of problem you think it's solving. But the main thing is to try and get some connection between the activities that you're undertaking and what you're trying to actually achieve. And that, I think, is where we start from. Is like, what are we actually addressing, or where are we deficient as a business? Where are we behind? And not just make the leap of faith assumption that if we improve X, Y metric will go up. When Y metric goes up, it will translate into Z money. You know, so it's like very focused on trying to achieve or support achieve certain tasks, or support other aspects of the business activity with what they're trying to achieve.
Okay, so I had a very wise marketer who said one of his little golden nuggets was he'd interview customers that had just been acquired, and he would ask them, what are the things that nearly prevented you from purchasing? And he said he got so much gold from those things, all those little barriers to purchase, that were probably happening to a stronger degree to people who didn't end up purchasing. But by interviewing them straight off fresh of the sale, he said those little golden nuggets were like, awesome. And that was a little quick
amazing
win. You know, in CX, are there some little quick wins? Because everybody likes quick wins, right? Is there some little things that no matter what company you go into that you can go, okay, let's do this, and we'll get some really good feedback? And
oh yeah, for sure. So the Holy Trinity for me is always expectations, effort, and stress. They all have different causes, but to pick stress, for example, error proofing is a huge thing. If you just pick a part of the customer experience and you get a piece of paper with 3 columns on, possible errors, how we could prevent them, and then the third column is detect and recover, like how we could allow people to recover from them gracefully. And you write down all the possible mistakes that people could make and how you could prevent them from ever happening, and how, if you can't prevent them, you could help people to recover. It's transformative. So error proofing is a huge opportunity, I think. And those other ones, just expectation-wise in particular, are we setting a clear expectation with somebody, or are they making it up for themselves? You know, 99% of the time, people don't have lofty expectations. They just want to know. And if you can tell them it won't arrive tomorrow, it'll arrive the day after, they're like, okay. Or whatever it might be, just setting expectations rather than trying to meet an expectation that's never been set is is much better. So those are the kinds of things that I think are very, very easy to, typically very, very easy to implement.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Holy Trinity. I like it. Best of three. It's
Yeah.
things in threes are always the best.
Yeah.
I suppose you
Yeah.
touched on before as well the multi-departmental sort of focus and remit of the CX field, and how you can almost get a bit lost by trying to look at every little brand contact point. And so this sort of brings up some of the issues with CX initiatives, because you have to deal with multiple departments and silos and politics that goes along with that. So
Or just create a new one on top.
yeah, exactly. So there's this
Yeah.
really good comic that just came out today by Tom Fishburne, who's probably one of my favorite commentators on industry. You probably know him already with his comics
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah. I've
marketing.
seen the cartoons. Yeah.
And this one was specific to CX. And look, I'll put the link in the comments. But there's this when he does a new strip, he writes a bit of commentary on it, gets a quote from someone in the industry, and then has some of his older strips underneath the page. And there's this quote from Brian Solis, who's the global innovation evangelist. It's a very lofty name at Salesforce, and he says, legacy roles that only focus on stages of the customer journey in isolation without coordinating with those who manage other connected touch points will lose favor with customers. And he just talks about how, the need for cross-functional collaboration is like imperative, and it's going to become the new standard. And it's going to be the new table stakes. So if you don't do that already, you're kind of already behind. Do you think, and in your experience, departmental silos and the politics that go associated with that is the biggest barrier to effective CX implementation? Or what's the biggest barrier that you see? Like, you've identified the problem and you want to fix it.
It's so hard to answer that because I'm just running through like a Rolodex of projects and I'm thinking, was that the unifying theme?
Maybe some recent projects that you've consulted on, or in the past that you did some good job on, had some recommendations, but then they didn't get implemented, and you're like, well, why is that?